The cry tore through the wilderness like a wound opening in the night. It was not the howl of a wolf, or the shriek of an owl. It was the brittle sound of something human breaking against the cold. Elias froze where he stood by the woodpile, snow burning his lungs with every breath. The world around him lay drowned in silence, save for the moan of the wind pushing through black branches. Then it came again. Softer this time. A sound too frail to belong to the living for much longer. He dropped the kindling from his arms and followed. There she was, crumpled against a snowdrift, skin like wax, lips cracked and blue. Her body was a thin vessel fighting the storm's endless hunger. What she wore did not belong to winter. It was fragments of a wedding dress, white once, now ragged, stained with earth and frost. The veil clung to her hair like a shroud. She tried to move when he reached her, but strength had abandoned her limbs. Elias gathered her into his arms. She weighed less than the sack of grain he'd hauled in that morning, and yet she carried the weight of a sorrow he could not name. Inside his small cabin, the air was thick with pine smoke and the quiet crackle of fire. He laid her close to the hearth, pulling heavy wool blankets over her shivering form. Her eyes flickered open, dark and deep as river stone. They were filled with something beyond fear, something like defiance, though it was dimmed by exhaustion. He offered her a tin cup of water. Her hands trembled so badly he had to hold it for her, lifting it to her lips. She drank as though she had forgotten how. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why she had been cast into the snow in such cruel attire. A man learns on the frontier that not every wound needs probing. Not every truth comes on the first night. He only asked her name. A whisper slipped from her mouth. It was more breath than word. Ayoka. The syllables lingered in the room, foreign and soft, like a prayer from a forgotten world. She turned her face away as if ashamed of the sound. Elias did not press further. He knew the weight of names and how they carried stories too heavy for strangers to hold. Through the long hours, she drifted between sleep and waking. Sometimes she murmured fragments, shadows of betrayal, the bitterness of rejection, the cruelty of being discarded after vows had been spoken and promises shattered. She had been given, then abandoned, as though her spirit were something to barter and discard. He listened, saying nothing. Words were not his trade. His silence was steady, the kind that holds rather than judges. Outside, the wind pressed harder, flinging ice against the shutters. Elias kept the fire alive. Each log fell into the flames with a dull thud. Now and again he glanced at her. He saw how her breathing steadied, how color returned in faint traces to her cheeks. There was strength in her, even as she lay broken, a core of iron beneath the ruin. He recognized it because he carried a shard of the same thing in himself. Toward midnight, she stirred. Her gaze met his. In that look was the smallest crack in her armor, an unspoken question of why he bothered, why he had not turned her back to the night. He gave her no answer beyond placing another blanket over her shoulders. Sometimes mercy itself is the only answer. The cabin settled into its rhythm. The night stretched long and bitter. He thought of his years alone, the emptiness of days spent with nothing but cattle and earth and sky. He had built his life to endure silence, but this silence was different. It carried another heartbeat within it, fragile, unfamiliar, necessary. He nearly drifted into sleep when a sound cut through the storm. It was distant, deep, like drums muffled by snow. He rose and pressed his ear to the cold log wall. Horses, many of them. Their hooves were muffled in the drifts, but they were moving with purpose. His stomach tightened into a cold knot. She sat upright on the pallet, her eyes wide, listening. In the flicker of the firelight, the veil still clung to her hair like a ghost of vows unkept. Fear crossed her face, but behind it, something else. A desperate hope that he might not give her back. Elias stepped to the window, peering through a gap in the frost. Shapes shifted in the darkness, shadows circling like wolves, men astride horses, their forms dark against the snow. Warriors, gathering. The drumbeat wasn't the wind after all. It was the sound of hearts prepared for vengeance. He reached for the rifle leaning by the door. His hand was steady, though his breath was heavy. He knew that come dawn, he would not be standing alone. The snow around the cabin crackled under boots. Voices rose, low and guttural, in a tongue he did not understand, yet felt in his bones. And in the silence between their calls, he understood the terrible truth. They had not lost her. They had come to claim her back. The fire hissed, spitting sparks. He turned, meeting her gaze once more. She clutched the blanket to her body, torn between terror and the faintest ember of trust. By morning, his cabin would no longer be a place of shelter. It would be a battlefield. The first streak of dawn broke pale and thin across the snow. The light brought no peace. Elias stood on the cabin's porch, his boots rooted in the frost, his rifle cradled in his hands like a final vow. The air was sharp enough to cut his lungs. Before him stretched a ring of horsemen. Their shadows were long and menacing in the weak light. Their eyes glimmered beneath painted brows, steady and unyielding. They had come not with haste, but with a chilling certainty, as if the earth itself had delivered them to his doorstep. Behind him, Ayoka lingered in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket. Her face was pale, but her gaze was fierce. She carried a kind of quiet that was not surrender, but resistance honed by pain. Elias felt her eyes on him and drew strength from it. The odds were heavy, heavier than any man could bear with muscle alone. The leader of the riders stepped forward. His horse stamped, sending clouds of steam into the morning air. His words cut the cold, sharp and unbending. He demanded the woman be returned. His voice carried not just command, but the conviction of one who has been wronged. The thunder of kinsmen seeking retribution. Elias could not understand every syllable, but the meaning poured through. Give her back, or bleed for her. He did not move. His rifle, though steady, felt like a fragile stick in a storm. He spoke slowly, his voice like gravel. He told them she would not be returned. Not to the cruelty of the man who had cast her aside. Not to a fate that saw her as less than human. His words were plain, without grandeur, but they were bound tight with conviction. A murmur passed among the warriors. One lifted his bow, then lowered it again as the leader raised a hand. The circle drew tighter. Snow crunched beneath the hooves. The cabin shrank, becoming a cage of wood and firelight. Elias felt every muscle coil, not for attack, but for the holding of ground. Then Ayoka stepped forward. Her bare feet brushed the frozen boards of the porch. She did not hide behind him. She stood where the men could see her, eyes blazing, though her body trembled. She spoke. Her voice broke through the frozen air like a river cracking ice. The words were hers alone, and though Elias did not know them all, he felt their weight. She named her abandonment. She named the man who had broken his vow. She declared she would not return. The circle of warriors faltered. They shifted in their saddles, their faces a mixture of pride and shame, torn between the laws of their people and the fire in her words. Elias watched their leader's face harden, then soften, as if struck by a truth too sharp to deny. Still, the tension did not break. Spears glittered in the dawn's light. Arrows quivered in drawn bows. Elias lifted his rifle higher. He knew a single spark would ignite blood across the snow. And then he spoke once more. He told them he did not claim her, that she was not his possession, not his prize. He said she was her own, free to choose where her steps would fall. He spoke of dignity, of a worth beyond barter or pride. His voice shook, not from fear, but from the burden of a truth that demanded to be heard. Silence fell, heavy and thick. A crow cried from the trees, wings scattering frost from the branches. The warriors did not move. Then, slowly, the leader lowered his hand. The bows eased, the spears dipped, the circle opened like a gate unbarred. One by one, the riders turned their horses, leaving only dark trails in the snow. The leader was the last to go. His gaze lingered on Ioka, not with tenderness, but with a reluctant, grudging respect. Then he wheeled his horse and vanished into the trees. The silence that followed was heavier than the clash of battle. Elias lowered his rifle, his arms trembling now that the danger had passed. The air smelled of smoke and frost and something new, something like freedom. Ioka stepped from the doorway and came to stand beside him. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her choice was made in the quiet, in the way she stayed at his side when she could have walked away. The cabin, once a fortress against loneliness, seemed different in that pale morning light. It was no longer just his shelter. It had become theirs. The fire inside hissed low. The snow began to fall again, softer this time, as if the world itself had exhaled in relief. Elias looked at her and found not a stranger, not a burden, but a companion whose presence changed the very shape of his silence. But even as a new peace settled between them, a new question took root in his mind. Who was the man who had abandoned her? And why did the leader of the warriors look not just angry, but betrayed? The danger was past, but their story was only just beginning. The warriors were gone, but the threat they left behind lingered like a ghost. Elias couldn't shake the look on the leader's face. It wasn't just the face of a man seeking to reclaim a woman. It was the face of a man avenging a broken treaty. A treaty Elias knew nothing about. Life in the cabin found a new, fragile rhythm. Ioka healed. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She learned the landscape of his small home, her hands tracing the rough wood of the table, the smooth stone of the hearth. She learned his silences, too. She saw the way his gaze would drift to the empty space where another chair should have been. She saw the worn leather of a child's saddle, too small for any horse he now owned, tucked away in the rafters of the barn. He was a man hollowed out by loss, just like her. One evening, as she was mending a tear in her ruined dress, he spoke, his voice low. "My wife and son," he said, not looking at her. "Fever, 3 winters back, buried them myself, right over that ridge." She didn't offer empty sympathies. She just nodded, her needle pausing for a single, respectful beat before continuing its work. His grief was a language she understood. But her own story remained locked away. The name of the man who had left her to die in the snow remained unspoken. The reason for the warrior's arrival remained a mystery, until the day the traitor came. His name was Silas Kane. He was a man who moved with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he owned the world, one piece at a time. He arrived in a fine buckboard, pulled by 2 perfectly matched grays. He wore a city coat and a hat that hadn't seen a day of real work. He stopped at Elias's fence line. He didn't get down. He just sat there, watching the cabin. Elias stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. "You're on private land," Elias said. Kane smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "I'm aware. I'm here to see if you found something of mine." His eyes flicked toward the cabin door, where Ioka had appeared, her face pale. "I haven't," Elias said. "Really?" Kane's smile widened. "Because I had an arrangement, an agreement with Chief Black Moon, for his daughter, a marriage of convenience. To secure a land passage, I require through his territory." Elias's blood ran cold. "But it seems the bride got cold feet," Kane continued, his eyes locking onto Ioka. "Ran off with the groom I'd sent to fetch her, a warrior named Kale, Black Moon's own nephew. Imagine my surprise when Kale returned alone, claiming she'd vanished in a storm. And imagine my further surprise when my scouts told me a woman matching her description was seen sheltering here. The pieces slammed into place. The warriors hadn't been hostile. They had been searching for their lost kin, who they thought was with her intended husband. The man who had abandoned her was Kale, one of their own. And the entire marriage, the entire arrangement, was a lie orchestrated by this man. "She's not going with you," Elias said, his voice hard as stone. "Oh, I think she is," Kane said smoothly. "You see, my agreement with Black Moon is quite clear. If the marriage doesn't proceed, our trade agreement is void, and without my shipments of winter grain, his people will starve before the snow melts. He wants her back, not out of love, out of necessity." He held up a piece of paper, a legal document. "This gives me the right to reclaim what is owed, and if you interfere, well, the local marshal is a very good friend of mine." It was a perfect trap. Elias could fight, but that would bring the law down on them, and it would condemn Ayoka's people to starvation. Kane's gaze was cold, triumphant. "So, you see, rancher, you can play the hero, or you can let her do her duty. Your choice." The ultimatum hung in the air, a poison that tainted everything. The fragile peace they had built, the unspoken hope that had started to grow between them. It was all about to be ripped apart. Ayoka stepped forward, her head held high. The choice wasn't his to make, it was hers, and she was done being a pawn in any man's game. "I will not go with you," Ayoka said, her voice clear and cold. It cut through the quiet of the valley. Silas Kane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected tears, pleading. He was not prepared for defiance. "My dear," he said, his voice dripping with false patience, "you don't seem to understand the situation. Your people need my grain. Your chief has given his word. This is not about what you want." "It is always about what I want," she replied, taking another step forward. Elias moved with her, a silent shadow at her side. "You made a deal for land, using my life as currency. The man you sent, my own kinsman, left me to die in a blizzard. You think I will honor an agreement sealed with such treachery?" Kane's face hardened. "Your kinsman's cowardice is no concern of mine. The deal stands." "Then the deal is with a dead woman," Ayoka said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because I will die here on this porch before I become your key to a locked gate." The air crackled. Kane's hand twitched, moving toward the inside of his fine coat. "I wouldn't," Elias warned, his rifle now held a little less casually. Kane stared at them, at the lone rancher with nothing to lose, at the woman who looked like she'd already walked through fire and was not afraid of the ashes. He saw an obstacle he couldn't buy and couldn't easily break. He let out a short, sharp laugh. "Very well. Have it your way. But don't think this is over." He gave a curt nod. "Winter is long, and hunger is a very persuasive argument." With that, he turned his buckboard around and rode away, leaving his threat hanging in the air like the smell of smoke. They had won the standoff, but they had lost the war. Ayoka knew what Kane's words meant. She would be a pariah among her own people, the woman whose pride had condemned them to a season of starvation. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the cold hearth, the weight of her choice pressing down on her. Elias came and sat beside her. He didn't speak, just handed her a cup of warm tea. "I have doomed them," she whispered into the darkness. "You chose freedom," he corrected gently. "There is no doom in that. My father will not see it that way. He will see only betrayal. Then your father is blind to what a daughter's strength is worth." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a terrible sadness. "Kale, my cousin. He was always weak. He feared our father more than he feared the storm. Kane must have promised him something, or threatened him. "It doesn't matter," Elias said. "He made his choice. You made yours." In the days that followed, a grim resolve settled over the cabin. They had defied Cain. Now they had to survive him. Elias began to fortify the ranch, reinforcing doors, clearing brush from around the cabin to create a clear line of fire. But Ayoka knew a fortress wasn't enough. They couldn't fight an entire tribe or the law that Cain controlled. There had to be another way. The answer, she realized, wasn't in fighting. It was in the land itself. She remembered stories from her grandmother, stories of hidden winter trails through the mountains, of sheltered valleys where small herds of buffalo still roamed, unknown to the white hunters, places her people had not used in a generation. She began to draw in the dirt with a stick, a map of memories, a map of hope. "There are other paths," she told Elias, showing him the crude drawing. "Other ways to survive the winter. If I can get word to my people, if they would listen, they will listen to you," Elias said, with a certainty that startled her. "After you stood before them, they saw their daughter, not just their chief's bargain." It was a desperate gamble. It would mean leaving the safety of the cabin and riding back toward the very people who might see her as a traitor. But as she looked at Elias, at the steady belief in his eyes, she knew she had to try. They left 2 days later, under the cover of a moonless night, not as fugitives, but as messengers. They were no longer just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for the survival of an entire people. They were riding to offer a new path, a path forged not from a rich man's tainted grain, but from the land itself. But they both knew that Silas Cain and his hired guns would not let them go so easily. And Cale, the man torn between his greed and his kinship, was a wild card that could either save them or destroy them completely. The first challenge came sooner than they expected. As they rode through a narrow pass, 2 riders emerged from the rocks ahead. It wasn't Cain's men. It was warriors from Ayoka's own tribe, and at their lead was Cale. His face was a mask of conflict, shame, anger, and a sliver of fear. He looked at Ayoka, then at Elias, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "You should not have come back," he said, his voice rough. "You have shamed us all." "The only shame," Ayoka replied, her voice ringing with a cold fury, "is the man who leaves a woman to die in the snow for a white man's promise." Cale flinched as if struck. The warriors behind him shifted, their eyes darting between him and Ayoka. "Cain holds the future of our people in his hands," Cale argued, his voice weak. "What would you have me do?" "I would have you be a man," she shot back, "not a dog who licks the hand that holds the leash." She pushed her horse forward, showing them the map she had drawn on a piece of buckskin. "There is another way, the old paths, the winter grounds our grandmothers spoke of. We don't need his poison grain." The warriors murmured among themselves. It was a story they all knew, a legend of a time before the white men, before the treaties that had shrunk their world. Kyle looked at the map, then at her, his face a storm of indecision. He was trapped between the old ways and the new, between honor and survival. Before he could make his choice, a rifle shot cracked through the canyon. One of the warriors cried out and slumped over his horse, an arrow of blood blossoming on his chest. From the rocks above, Silas Cain appeared, a smoking rifle in his hand. He was not alone. A dozen of his hired guns lined the ridge, their weapons aimed down at the small group. "It seems your family reunion is over," Cain called out, his voice dripping with triumph. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He wasn't looking at Ayoka. He was looking at Cale. The boy was supposed to handle this quietly, but he failed. So now, we do it my way. The trap had been sprung. Cain hadn't just been waiting for them. He had been using Cale to lead him right to them. "Cale," Ayoka whispered, her heart breaking. "What have you done?" Kale looked from Kane's smug face to the dead warrior on the ground, and something inside him finally shattered. With a roar of pure animal rage, he drew his knife and charged, not at Ayoka, but straight up the rocky slope toward Silas Kane. The battle for the future of his people, and for his own soul, had begun. Kale's charge was a desperate, suicidal act of redemption. Kane's men opened fire, and Kale fell before he had taken 10 steps, his body riddled with bullets. But his sacrifice was not in vain. In that single, chaotic moment, Elias and Ayoka acted. "The rocks!" Elias yelled, pulling Ayoka from her horse and dragging her toward a cluster of boulders as bullets chewed up the ground around them. The remaining warrior, loyal to Kyle, let out a fierce war cry and returned fire, providing them with precious seconds of cover before he, too, was cut down. They were pinned down, outnumbered, with no escape. "This is it," Elias said, his voice grim as he reloaded his rifle. "We make our stand here." "No," Ayoka said, her eyes blazing. "We make them pay." She remembered the narrow game trail they had passed a half-mile back. It was a treacherous path, but it led up the side of the canyon. If we can reach the high ground, it was their only chance. Under the cover of Elias's fire, they began to scramble up the rocky slope, dust and splinters flying around them. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Elias's coat. Another ricocheted off a rock near Ayoka's head, stinging her cheek with stone fragments. But they didn't stop. They reached the trail and plunged into the thick brush. Kane's men followed, their shouts echoing below. It was a desperate race against time. They burst out onto a high, narrow ledge overlooking the canyon. The drop was 100 feet straight down. They were trapped. Kane and his men appeared at the end of the ledge, blocking their only way back. Kane's face was flush with victory. "Nowhere left to run, my dear," he said with a cruel smile. But Ayoka wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, at the rock face behind. Her eyes widened. "Elias," she whispered, "the paintings." On the wall of the cliff, faded by centuries of sun and wind, were ancient petroglyphs, the same symbols she had seen in her grandmother's stories, the symbols that marked the entrance to the hidden winter grounds. The map wasn't just a route, it was a key. "The heart of the mountain," she breathed, understanding dawning. She pointed to a deep fissure in the rock, almost completely hidden by a curtain of ancient vines. There. It was a desperate gamble. As Kane and his men advanced, Elias laid down covering fire while Ayoka tore at the vines, revealing a dark, narrow opening. "Go!" Elias yelled, firing his last shot. She scrambled into the darkness. Elias dove in after her, just as a volley of bullets slammed into the rock where they had been standing. They were inside a cave, a tunnel leading deep into the mountain. They ran, stumbling in the pitch black, until they saw a faint light ahead. They emerged into a place of impossible beauty, a vast hidden valley, warmed by geothermal springs, filled with lush grass and a herd of buffalo, grazing peacefully by a crystal-clear lake. They had found it, the winter grounds. Her grandmother's stories were real, but their relief was short-lived. A shadow fell over the entrance of the cave. Silas Kane stood there, his face a mask of triumph. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" he sneered. "I've known about this place for months. That's what the deal with your father was really about. This valley, my own private paradise." He raised his rifle. "And you two just saved me the trouble of finding the front door." But as he aimed, a new sound echoed through the valley. The sound of dozens of horses and a war cry that shook the very foundations of the mountain. From the far end of the valley, a line of warriors appeared, riding hard. At their lead was Chief Black Moon, Ayoka's father. He had not believed Kane's lies. He had followed his daughter, his heart finally choosing her over a white man's poison promises. Kane froze, his face a picture of disbelief. He was trapped between the man he had betrayed and the people he had tried to starve. The final battle was short and brutal. Cain's greed was no match for the fury of a people fighting for their home, and for a father fighting for his daughter. In the end, Cain lay dead on the green grass of the paradise he had tried to steal. Ayoka stood with her father, the silence between them filled with a new, hard-won understanding. Elias stood beside her, his hand finding hers. They had survived. The tribe had a future. And in the heart of the mountain, two people from two different worlds had found a home. Their story, and the story of their children, was just beginning. If you believe that courage can build a bridge between any two worlds, and that hope can survive even the longest, coldest winter, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We tell the stories that history forgot, the tales of the men and women who carved a life out of the dust and the danger, and who proved that family is about who you stand with, not just where you come from. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and what you think of Ayoka and Elias's incredible journey. We'll see you next time, with another story from the heart of the American West. Thanks for watching.